Norge har vært fast inventar i det myteomspunne Bilderberg-forumet siden starten i 1954. Hvert år, nesten uten unntak, har minst én nordmann vært til stede når 120 av verdens mektigste møtes bak lukkede dører. Den norske deltagelsen begynte med rederiet Høeg. Leif Høeg deltok allerede første år. I årene som fulgte kom navn som Jens Christian Hauge, statsråd i 3 arbeiderpartiregjeringer, journalist og arbeiderpartipolitiker Finn Mo, banksjef og høyremann Sjur Lindebrekke, deretter Kåre Willoch i 1962, høyrepolitiker og forsvarsminister og skipsreder Otto Grieg Tidemann i 1967 og Thorvald Stoltenberg i 1973. Et høydepunkt i norsk Bilderberger-historie kom i 1982, da konferansen for første og hittil eneste gang ble arrangert i Norge på Rika Park Hotel i Sandefjord. Hele 11 nordmenn deltok, deriblant Thorvald Stoltenberg, Gro Harlem Brundtland, Kåre Willoch, Sven Stray, Anders C. Sjåstad, Knut Frydenlund, Hermod Skånland, Tor Måsund, Nils Werring jr. og Tinius Nagel Eriksen. Og siden da har navn som kronprins Harald den gangen, Torbjørn Jagland, Kristin Clemet, Siv Jensen, kronprins Håkon, Erna Solberg, Christian Rynning Tønnesen og Børge Brende vært å finne på deltagerlistene. På 2000- og 2010-tallet har Norge vært representert nesten hvert eneste år, særlig gjennom næringslivstopper. Hydrosjef Svein Richard Brandtzæg var med så ofte at han nærmest fikk fast plass med deltagelse 8 år på rad. Men det er ikke bare industrikapitalen som inviteres til hemmelig selskap bak lukkede dører. Pressen har også hatt plass ved bordet. Aftenpostens daværende politiske redaktør Trine Eilertsen deltok i 2015, og VGs Hanne Skartveit i 2018, begge som såkalte private individer. En konstruksjon som skulle tillate redaktører å delta uten presseplikt, noe som har vekket etisk debatt. De 2 mest sentrale norske navnene knyttet til Bilderberger gjennom tidene er allikevel far og sønn, Thorvald og Jens Stoltenberg. Thorvald som diplomat og FN-megler ble invitert flere ganger på 70-, 80- og 90-tallet, og Jens kom inn i 2002 som fersk eks-statsminister. En invitasjon som føyer seg inn i Bilderbergers kjente praksis med å plukke ut såkalte kommende stjerner tidlig. Sånn som de da gjorde med Clinton og Blair. Etter noen års fravær returnerte Jens som NATOs generalsekretær i 2015 og deltok også i 2017 og i 2018. Og i 2018 så holdt han til og med hovedtalen på konferansens bankett. Høsten 2024, etter å ha gått av som NATO-sjef, ble Jens Stoltenberg utnevnt til medleder for hele Bilderberger-nettverket. En rolle han nå deler med amerikansk-kanadiske Marie José Kravis. Som medleder så er han med på å forme både deltagerlistene og dagsorden. Selv har han omtalt Bilderberger som en viktig plattform for å styrke båndene mellom Europa og USA på linje med sikkerhetskonferansen i München. Men ikke alle ser på Bilderberger med akademisk nysgjerrighet. Gruppen har i flere tiår vært gjenstand for dype mistanker. Den mest utbredte konspirasjonsteorien er at Bilderberger fungerer som en global skyggeregjering, et maktnettverk som styrer utviklingen bak kulissene. En variant av denne teorien hevder at gruppen aktivt utpeker fremtidige ledere Clinton i 91, Blair i 93, Merkel i 2005 og i norsk sammenheng, Siv Jensen i 2006 og Erna Solberg i 2011. Teoretikerne de tolker da dette som en form for elite-grooming, der Bilderberg gir velsignelsen før valgurnene gjør det. Og om det her er en innsiktsfull analyse eller bare politisk eventyr pakket inn i paranoia, det avhenger av øynene som leser. Men hva er egentlig Bilderberger? Og hvordan henger det sammen med FN, Verdens økonomiske forum og andre overnasjonale organisasjoner? Og hvorfor trenger egentlig politikere og forretningsfolk både åpne overnasjonale organisasjoner og hemmelige overnasjonale organisasjoner? Og hva er målet med det her? Til å svare på, eller i alle fall forsøke å svare på disse spørsmålene, har vi invitert den prisbelønte internasjonale journalisten, forfatteren og foredragsholderen Alex Newman. Welcome, Alex. You're known for your unapologetically conservative and Christian worldview.
Yes, it's great to be here. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Glad to be here.
Very happy that you could join me. You're also the president of Liberty Sentinel Media, and you have written for numerous publications, both in the US and internationally, The New American, WorldNet Daily, Epoch Times, and Crisis Magazine, right?
Yeah, tons of different magazines over the years, Newsweek, Swiss News, lots of American newspapers and newspapers around the world. So that's what I do.
So more importantly, you have been very vocal about your critical view of globalism, socialism, the United Nations, and etc., which is what has brought you here today because you followed the Bilderberg-gruppen for a long time. And I'm wondering, you've been very outspoken about the dangers of unelected elites meeting behind closed doors. What do you believe is really going on inside the Bilderberg-gruppen?
Well, I think the best way to understand the Bilderberg organization is an effort to bring new potential recruits into the movement. So you have some of the old established figures of globalism. You have your Rockefellers and your Kissingers and people who've been in this movement for decades. And then you have people that might be promising, right? People like Bill Clinton, some no-name governor from Arkansas that nobody's ever heard of. And he comes and shows his willingness to sell out his people and advance the cause of globalism and the banking elites. And then he gets promoted to president. People like Tony Blair, a no-name member of parliament that nobody ever heard of, who bends the knee and suddenly gets promoted to prime minister. Or as the BBC reported some years ago, virtually every president of the so-called president of the European Union attended Bilderberg right before becoming president of the European Union. So it seems to me, aside from an opportunity to meet and discuss things behind closed doors that they wouldn't want in the newspapers, it seems to me to be an opportunity to recruit new people into their leadership ranks, to try to kind of see where they're at without the buzz of the cameras and the media. And you know, some of them show up and they never come back. And my guess is they were determined to be not suitable for further career advancement. So I think it's really a recruiting ground, a training ground, a testing ground to see how far people are willing to go. And that's, I guess, my understanding of the role of the Bilderberg. But they do decide a lot of important policies. If you go back over the years and look at what members and attendees have revealed publicly in media interviews, quite a few times they've admitted that they played a major role in bringing about the euro and promoting European integration and major geopolitical developments like those.
So that kind of answers the questions that I had coming into this interview. Like, what's the point of all of these over-national organizations where the same people meet, that being publicly or behind closed doors? Because we have the Bilderberger, we have the UN, we have the World Economic Forum, and the list goes on. And they keep meeting, and it's the same people, decision makers, and people with money coming together. So looking at Bilderberger as a sort of testing ground actually makes sense, but it's also a huge part of what they call, or what they say is the conspiracy, is that it's sort of a training ground where they point out important politicians before the voters do. How do you view that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on. They identify people that look promising, people who have moved up on their own, and people who might be ideologically inclined to serve this one world agenda. And they invite them there and they have discussions with them and they treat them really well and they say, you know, you can have a really big future ahead of you in politics or business. And, you know, what do you think about the United Nations? What do you think about sustainable development? What do you think about your own country? And, you know, just listen to what they have to say is, I think, what goes on there. But ultimately, Bilderberg is one gear in a much bigger machine, right? And the machine is designed to do a few things. At the end destination, they want to essentially remove nations. They want to undermine family. They want to undermine church. They want to undermine any institution that stands in the way of total centralized power at the international level. And so I think the simplest way to understand their final goal to look at communist China and then impose that on the whole world, right? A world where you have virtually no freedom, a world where you are constantly surveilled, where everything you do, everything you say, everything you buy is monitored, is tracked, is processed by artificial intelligence. And then you get a social credit score to determine whether you're a good slave or a potentially rebellious slave, and then your privileges are based on that. Now, they do believe that there are way too many of us on the planet, and that's not a secret. They say that pretty regularly. They think that there are too many human beings and that we would be better off with less. And so they have different organizations that move ultimately toward this goal, but I would argue that the Bilderberg is certainly one of the critical ones, and it serves an important role in terms of bringing elites from Europe, elites from the United States, and occasionally from some of the other places, Russia, Turkey, things like this, all together so they can plot at the kind of transatlantic level. The transatlantic partnership has always been critical to this movement. In fact, if you look at the strategy for world order that they were pursuing back in the 40s and the 50s, it involved first uniting Europe, then uniting Europe with the United States, and then from there using that as a nucleus to build the one world system. And Bilderberg obviously has been a critical part of that whole process.
So Donald Trump must have just ruined everything for them.
I think Donald Trump has been a major thorn in their side. They're trying, of course, we have an expression in the United States, to make lemonade out of lemons. Lemons are sour and you don't like them, but you can put some sugar in and try to make the best of a bad situation. And I think they're trying to do that with Donald Trump right now. If you look at Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, who, of course, has been a very important front man for this agenda, he writes in his book on COVID-19 and the Great Reset that people were getting really upset with globalism, or globalization as he calls it. And so he says we have an in-between solution, is the term that he uses. And that in-between solution is to go back to regionalization or regional government. And so he uses the European Union as the premier example of that. But he also talks about how even in North America, we're moving in that direction. Integration between Canada, the United States, and Mexico through first the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which that's how the European Union started, coal and steel community, then the European Free Trade Agreement, and also other mechanisms now like what they got Trump to sign, the USMCA. So they're going to keep trying to undermine national sovereignty. They're going to keep trying to advance on all these different fronts where they can. But they certainly seem to recognize that Donald Trump is a threat to their at least one world vision. And so I think what they're trying to do now is use this chaos as a way to advance on other fronts. And we see that happening right now so clearly with the regionalization. Well, if they can't usurp sovereignty and move it to the UN level, although they're still trying, right now they're working on the global tax through the International Maritime Organization. The International Court of Justice is working on this climate decision that should come out later this year. But in the meantime, they'll work on building up the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the CELAC, the Caribbean and Latin American Community of Nations. So they'll keep moving on all those fronts while they try to wait out Donald Trump. And then hopefully, from their perspective, they can just pick up where they left off when Donald Trump is out of office.
Do you think the World Economic Forum's decline, because I would like to call it decline. Klaus Schwab has been, he's not in the good type of limelight. Not that he ever was in my eyes, but in the eyes of the media, with his accusations of fraud and God knows what, he was doing discrimination and all of this, and him leaving his post 2 years prior to when the World Economic Forum originally said that he would be leaving his board of chairs, and also the US or Donald Trump not giving money to the World Economic Forum anymore. Has that halted it somehow? The temporary fall of World Economic Forum have any sort of will it affect their work in any way, do you think?
I think the closest parallel to what we're seeing right now with the fall of Klaus Schwab is what happened with Stalin in the Soviet Union. And that may seem like a strange comparison until you realize Klaus Schwab is very, very friendly with, he had a big bust of Vladimir Lenin in his office. He's very, very pro-communist China, and he loves their model. In fact, he says it's a model for many countries, he likes to say. And so I think what's happening with Klaus Schwab is the people higher than him, and there are definitely people higher than him, realize that he had become a liability. The guy is like a cartoon villain that you might see in a children's cartoon for some evil maniac that wants to take over the world. Americans in particular have become really tired with the stuff that the World Economic Forum was promoting in terms of DEI and the climate change and the ESG, the sustainable development stuff. They don't like what it's been doing to our businesses and to our society. And so very much like what happened with Stalin in the Soviet Union after he was thrown under the bus, we can demonize Klaus Schwab and say, oh, he was the bad guy, but the World Economic Forum is still a good institution. It's just, we just have to purge the bad elements that came through Klaus Schwab because, yeah, he was bad. But I think a lot of people made the mistake of thinking that Klaus Schwab was the mastermind. And so I always remind people, Klaus Schwab was nothing until he hooked up with Henry Kissinger at Harvard University. Henry Kissinger was nothing until he became a little attack poodle for the Rockefeller dynasty. And so there's a clear chain of command here, right? Klaus Schwab worked with Henry Kissinger worked for the Rockefellers worked for Satan, and you just have this just kidding, half kidding, but clear chain of command there. And Klaus Schwab is expendable. So think of it like the mafia, right? The mafiosos, yes, they kill each other, and yes, they're ruthless, and they don't mind, drive-by shooting if they can take out somebody and put in a new person. But ultimately, they're all still moving toward the same agenda. And I think what we're seeing here really is a marketing change. They're going to throw Klaus Schwab under the bus, act like all the bad things were his fault, and try to preserve the influence of the World Economic Forum in terms of a strategic partner of the UN in implementing the Sustainable Development Agenda and so much more.
We'll see how that goes moving forward, but the mainstream media rarely covers these Bilderberger meetings, going back to Bilderberger. Yet these high-level editors, there's been 2 in Norway, has been invited on 2 occasions as so-called private individuals. Do you think this double standard is tolerated with people when you have editors of important newspapers being invited to these secret meetings, and all of a sudden they have no duty to tell people what's going on because they're private individuals?
Yeah, in my view, as a professional journalist, I find that abhorrent, right? As a journalist, my job is to find out what the powerful people are doing and tell the people about it, not to go conspire with the powerful people. I mean, that totally defeats the point of journalism. And at that point, you're not a journalist anymore. You're a puppet. You're a mouthpiece for the elites, which is literally like the opposite of the job description of a real journalist. And I think historically, journalism has always meant finding out what the powerful are doing and letting the not powerful know about it. So this is a total inversion of the principles of journalism. And frankly, I think these people should be ashamed of themselves. I have been to 2 Bilderberg meetings, never as an invited guest. I managed to sneak into one in Chantilly, Virginia, and they kept me outside of one in Copenhagen in Denmark some years ago. And I was able to talk to some of these people on and off record. And the whole idea that they're going as private individuals is really misleading. One of the people that I spoke with at the Bilderberg in Copenhagen, I'm trying to remember when this was, it might have been 2014, so maybe 11 years ago now, was the head of, at the time, the Dutch Labour Party. And I asked him point blank, are you here as a private individual? Because, in the United States, we have laws against our politicians negotiating with foreign powers in any kind of official capacity if they don't have specific approval from the President of the United States and on down the line. And so I asked this Dutch Labour Party leader, are you here as a private individual? And his response was very telling. We caught it on camera. He said, of course not. I'm always public. As a political leader, I'm always in my public capacity. And I guess he didn't get the memo that he was supposed to pretend like he's just there privately and there's nothing important being discussed. But he let the cat out of the bag. Of course, he didn't get invited again. I don't know if it had anything to do with letting the cat out of the bag there. But of course, these people are going there in their public capacity. They're not invited there to enjoy cocktails because they're such good company. They're invited there because of their strategic position in some organization of society, whether it be government, intelligence, military, media, business, academia, whatever the case may be. So these journalists ought to be absolutely ashamed of themselves. They should stop calling themselves journalists. And frankly, they're a disgrace to the profession.
So there's a lot of the legacy media or the bigger companies have been bought up by huge organizations. At least in Norway, we have 2 main organizations that own most of the media. We know how they cooperate with the Associated Press, how Associated Press cooperates with other big European press organizations. We do know that the EU is involved in how the press operates within the European Union. There is cooperation going on between the United States and the European Union. And so you have this chain of command where a lot of the journalists or editors that are invited to these sort of meetings that are supposed to be looking at these powerful people and tell people what's going on, but instead sneak in and wants to be a part of the party, they are a part of big organizations that people trust. People trust these people still. Don't ask me why, but people still trust these big newspapers. That be the BBC, the CNN, you I don't know, Norwegian companies like VG, Aftenposten, which I mentioned, or the state channel. And so what would you say to people to wake them up like that, to tell them, you know, it's not just about COVID, it's not about the climate scam where you have to buy you always have to buy something to save the climate. Have you noticed that?
Carbon credits from Al Gore. Yeah.
What?
Carbon credits, yes.
So what do you say to people to wake them up from this illusion that they can still trust these local papers who are really a part of a big organization who also are in these meetings behind closed doors?
Yeah, so there's good news and bad news on that front. The good news is here in the United States, and I'm American, I've lived almost my entire life overseas, but here in the United States where I live now and where I was born, Americans do not believe the media anymore. And the polling data show this very clearly. I think almost 2/3 of Americans in a recent poll that was released last year said they regard the media as enemies of the people. Okay, and I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that term. It kind of reminds me of, you know, something Fidel Castro might say, but I understand the sentiment. The media is not just dishonest, it's not just biased. It is actively working to undermine morality and society and liberty and sovereignty and family and everything that is good about life in this world. So they are, in a very real sense, enemies of humanity. Now, having lived almost a decade in Scandinavia, I know the Scandinavians are not quite as far along as we are here in America on waking up to this agenda. I stayed in Stockholm for almost a decade, just outside of Stockholm, and I know Swedes and Norwegians and Danes and even Finns are far more trusting of political institutions and media institutions than we are in the United States. But I think even there, the tide is starting to turn. And so I think the news can only lie so much before people start waking up. And I think that process is going to be irreversible. You never find somebody who wakes up to the fact that the media is lying who suddenly says, oh, but you know what? I think now I'm going to trust them again. Everybody is moving in our direction. So it's just a matter of time. And I think what they're doing now is they're entering into panic mode. Right now they're trying to figure out, how do we suppress these voices? Before it was how do we just marginalize them? Now it's how do we actively silence them? So now the European Union is trying to silence people on social media. They're trying to regulate social media. UNESCO is working on this project as well. So they're entering into the next phase now because they know they're losing the trust of people. And so now they're moving toward a much more active role in suppressing the truth. But even that, I don't think is going to work over the long term. You can only deceive people for so long because what happens is even the very trusting people, eventually they're going to come across something that they know really well, right? Whether it's this issue or that issue, maybe they're experts in this, maybe they had a particular job, and they're going to realize, wow, they're lying about this. If they're lying about this, what else might they be lying about? And so I think the big challenge now, to come back to the United States for a minute, the big challenge now is everybody knows they're lying, but people are still tuning in for cues about what's happening. So they read the news and they know it's full of lies, but they're missing something really important. It's not necessarily just the lies that are so dangerous. It's what is being omitted. What is it that they're not talking about that we need to know about? And to go back to some of the examples I mentioned earlier, the International Maritime Organization is right now working to impose the first ever global tax on humanity. Now, if the media were to put that on the front page and try to say, hey, it's great, we should all pay global taxes, Americans would laugh. Like, what kind of idiots are these? The trick is they just don't say anything about it, and then it becomes a done deal before anybody can stop it. So we need to keep active on exposing these people, but I think what will happen is people naturally gravitate toward the truth. That's why in the United States and around the world, alternative media is growing very, very rapidly. That's why the big newspapers in the United States are shutting down. They're firing their employees. This is a trend that I think is going to continue. And they'll try to use AI to perfect their censorship, to perfect their shadow banning, but ultimately I don't think it's going to work.
Well, let's not hope it will work, because the DSA, the Digital Service Act, is already implemented in the EU. We haven't gotten that in Norway yet, but it's on its way here. I'm starting to fear that we will have to go back to printing newspapers rather than put our news out online, because they are so adamant about censorship of media as well. Like they wanted to centralize media in the EU. I can't think of something more horrifying than the EU telling people what media they should read and allowing and censoring what media is allowed out there. So let's hope this trend is that the trend of legacy media going bankrupt is happening, and that they can't sustain this censorship. Our previous chief of NATO and also previous Norwegian prime minister, Jens Stoltenberg, who's now he came back to Norway, to our government, to take over the position of financial minister after our now prime minister really gaining unpopular views from the Norwegian people. He is now a co-chair of the Bilderberg steering committee. So what does that tell you about the group's alignment with global military and political architecture, thinking that they appoint the former chief of NATO?
It's very revealing. And, I think NATO really is best understood as the military arm of the New World Order until they can come up with something better, right? The UN's peacekeeping forces are kind of a joke, famous around the world for raping women and children, but not very effective in combat. The ragtag group of rebels can easily take them down. So they need something more professional. They need something more serious. And that's where NATO comes into play. And what you see, the relationship between NATO and the UN is very, very clear. In fact, in NATO's constitution, in NATO's charter, it specifically references that it's organized under the Charter of the United Nations. And what we see is that NATO has repeatedly been deployed on UN-approved missions. Libya was probably one of the more recent and more horrifying examples. The UN Security Council voted, and NATO was then deployed under the leadership of Barack Obama to turn that country's infrastructure into a wasteland and to overthrow that government. So NATO has played a very important role in the creation of this one world system that they're trying to build, and I imagine it will continue to do so. And so the integration between NATO and Bilderberg and all these different groups that make up the architecture of the push for global governance is very, very obvious to anybody who looks. And what it shows you is that they're active across all these fields, whether we're looking at media or military or government. They have identified all the key sectors of society that they think are necessary to advance their agenda. And of course, the military component is absolutely essential. I think eventually the importance of NATO will diminish. Right now, there's a very deliberate and concerted effort to diminish the Western world. We're watching the controlled demolition of the Western middle class. We're watching the exporting of all of our industries, of all our productive capacity, of all our technology. We're watching the opening of our borders so that the entire Western world can be overrun with people from alien cultures. And this is all very deliberate and strategic. They have now used NATO and the U.S. government and the U.S. military to rearrange the world so that now it's ready for the final stage, in their view, which is to take down and collapse Western institutions, Western traditions, based, of course, on biblical traditions, and even going back to Rome and Greece. They want to demolish that to make way for the new system that they envision imposing on all of humanity, which is more in line with the Chinese model. So I think we are in danger of a major third world war. And whether the flashpoint is Ukraine and Russia, whether it's what's going on in the Middle East right now, whether it's Pakistan and India, right? I just got back from India just a couple of weeks ago. I don't think they really care that much, whether it's China and Taiwan, right? It doesn't really matter that much from their perspective, as long as we can have a huge war that kills enormous numbers of people, in which the West, or what's left of the West, eventually loses. So I think there's a very real danger of that happening. And what will happen then is NATO will become maybe less important, maybe a kind of a regional power player as they move into these regional bloc systems. And then the rise of Communist China, Russia, the BRICS nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to end up with a kind of what they describe as a multipolar world order in preparation for the move toward a one world order. So I think NATO is very important to watch. It's a very, very dangerous institution. We've seen that it's been ideologically captured by people who actually despise what we were told it was supposed to protect, right? It was sold to us as a way to defend the West against tyranny. Now we see it as a tool of global tyranny. So very dangerous. But yeah, the integration between Bilderberg and NATO, and then you've got different groups like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bohemian Grove in California, Skull and Bones. Very, very clear and very, very dangerous.
So NATO they're not only caught up in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which I think will be the catalyst, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, Alex, because we keep getting these messages from our prime ministers in Norway and Sweden and throughout Europe that we have to prepare for war. And the war that they're referring to is the war with Russia. So I think they're gonna go for that. If that doesn't work, they'll probably, go for Gaza, Israel, or Pakistan, India, or something that makes our lives a living hell, excuse the language. But NATO has also been very caught up in climate change. It's not too long ago they were talking about climate change and how to combat climate change. And I sat here and I was thinking, is that NATO's task? Are they supposed to be talking about climate change? Like you said, they're set out to protect our rights as human beings and the values of the West and our nations, but that's not what they're doing. So in terms of that, do you think Bilderberger is more about synchronizing narratives than actually setting an actual policy? And if so, who do you think is pulling the strings for what happens in the Bilderberger meetings?
Well, I think Bilderberg does some of both, right? They do work on policy, and we've got very clear admissions from members, from attendees, and even from members of the steering committee that they do, in fact, work on policy while there, even though publicly they deny that, right? Even though in their press releases that they've started putting out in recent years, they say, we do not work on policy. They absolutely do, and we've got quite a few of their attendees on record speaking to the media, admitting that they're working on this. But yeah, synchronizing the narrative is absolutely critical. This is actually one of the key functions of several of these organizations. They get together and they come up with excuses and pretexts, like climate change is a very good example of this, right? The Club of Rome met in 1991. They decided, hey, the Cold War is ending, at least ending, quote unquote, and we need a new excuse to have these huge governments and these huge taxes and all this control over people's lives. And so they came up with the idea of climate change and pollution, because then they said humanity itself is the enemy. So they do come together in these kinds of meetings, and they bring together people from the former communist world, they bring together people from the West, they bring together people from China, and they set these narratives. Even at the people at the top, even though they don't believe them, they understand that their career depends on sticking to the narrative. And I know people at the very high levels of these institutions who will tell you privately, we all know the climate change thing is total baloney. All you have to look at, for example, are the policies that they've been doing. I was in Paris for the UN Paris Agreement negotiations, and you had Barack Obama saying we're going to cut American CO2 emissions by 30-something% in 10 years, and then the communist Chinese dictatorship saying, we're going to keep increasing them for the next 15 years, and they're all applauding, like that's going to save the climate. Of course, that results in massively more CO2 in the atmosphere. If you truly believed that CO2 is pollution, which is what the narrative says, everybody would recognize that this is totally insane. But the fake media doesn't report it, and so the narrative continues. And all these people at the top who know this is absurd pretend like they believe it, because they know if they want to keep their political power, if they want to keep their big paycheck coming from their company, they've got to toe the line. So that's a big part of what these meetings do. They coordinate policy behind the scenes, and they coordinate the narrative behind the scenes. And the two work in tandem, right? It's like two parallel tracks for a train track. You need both of them. You can't implement the policies without the narrative, and you can't have the narrative unless you know what policies you want to accomplish. So you need both of these tracks, and I think Bilderberg is obviously a key player in the transatlantic setting of the narratives and the policies.
So Bilderberger they play a huge part in the narrative, but you have the UN, which in my opinion is what they aim to be the global governance moving forward. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is how I see the UN. And Bilderberger, it's a secret society, but it's the same elites who attends the open forums like the UN. So you answered the question why they need both, but You've long argued that the UN isn't what it claims to be, and that it, in your view, is a platform for isn't just a platform for international cooperation, but it has morphed into more of a tool for top-down technocratic control. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And you can actually prove that the United Nations was always created to eventually become the nucleus for a totalitarian one world political, economic, and even religious system. And we can get into each of those components. But if you go back into the history of the UN, what you find is from the very beginning, this was their plan. And that's not speculation. So you look, for example, at the man who was Secretary of State for the United States during this time. That's like our foreign minister, I guess, if you need a Norwegian counterpart. And what he wrote in his book, this was published in 1950. It was called War or Peace. I actually have the quote in front of me. I'm just going to read it word for word here. He says, "The United Nations represents not a final stage in the development of world order, but only a primitive stage. Therefore, its primary task is to create the conditions which will make possible a more highly developed organization." He says, "I've never seen any proposal made for collective security with teeth in it, or for world government or world federation, which could not be carried out either by the United Nations or under the UN Charter." So this is one of the people who was instrumental in setting up the United Nations, telling you in plain English that the goal was always to turn the UN into a one world system. And as to the character of that one world system, again, all we have to do is go back in history and see what is very obvious there for everyone to see. So you look at the people who created the UN. They met in San Francisco in the aftermath of World War II. Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass-murdering savages to ever walk on this planet, sent his operative, Mr. Molotov, the guy that cocktail Molotovs were named after. He was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. And then the United States sent a guy called Alger Hiss. And he was a high-ranking operative at the State Department. And they liked him so much that they made him first the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. Then they made him the first Secretary General. And as a little aside note, he also took all of the delegates to this conference in San Francisco to a very nefarious place called Bohemian Grove, where there's a meeting of a secret society that brings together the most powerful men, not just in America, but in the world, presidents, CEOs, cabinet secretaries, kings, dictators. And nobody knows exactly what they did there, but we know some about this organization. They do weird rituals. Our president, Richard Nixon, wrote in his autobiography, the most important speech of his entire political career is the one he gave at the Bohemian Grove. He said because he was able to talk to the most powerful men in America without having to worry about public scrutiny. So very powerful group. And then fast forward a little bit, we threw Alger Hiss in prison. Okay, why? Because we found out he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So the main individual who created the United Nations, there was one person who was more important than any other in the creation of the UN. It was Alger Hiss. Again, chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter, first Secretary General of the UN. He was thrown in prison in the United States because he was a spy for one of the most murderous barbarians to ever walk on this planet. So we know it was always designed to be a one-world government, and we know it was designed with global tyranny in mind. So yes, the UN was set up for the purpose of becoming stronger and stronger and stronger until eventually all nations would be subsumed as kind of like administrative units or provinces in this one-world system. And we're moving very rapidly in that direction, Rebecca. I was at UN headquarters in September for what they call the Summit of the Future. And I don't know how much coverage it got in Norway, but I know in the United States it got almost no coverage. But they were calling it one of the most important meetings in the history of the UN. The way they framed it is we're transforming the UN from UN to, as they've said, UN 2.0. Right? So UN 1.0, that was supposed to be about peace and security, which of course it never brought either. UN 2.0, read the Pact for the Future, the outcome document that was adopted by consensus by the General Assembly. It's got to cover internet, education, the environment, the economy, culture, AI, you name it, it should be under the jurisdiction of the UN. And so, as I mentioned already, Rebecca, they're now working on creating the first ever global tax on humanity. They've wanted global taxes from the very beginning. But for the last 80 years, if the UN wanted money, they had to call up the Norwegian government, they had to call up the American government and say, hey, could you give us some money? We have a new program, a new plan, a new agency we want to create. And then governments could say yes or no. Once they have a direct tax, which they're working on imposing right now, they approved it just a few weeks ago in London. The final approval will be in October, and they expect to pass it. They will be able to tax shipping, right? But they say themselves, shipping is only 3% of emissions. If they can tax shipping to save us from climate change, to save Mother Earth, and that's only 3% of emissions, why can't they tax aviation. Why can't they tax agriculture, which is 30+% of global emissions? So we're now right at the edge of the UN throwing off the final shackles that have restrained its power. Once it gets the ability to tax us, it can fund armies and police and courts. And people need to realize, too, that this is now happening. It's not a hypothetical future threat. Just a few months ago, they arrested the former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. And, I don't know much about the guy. The only time he ever came on my radar was when he said the UN is evil and we should get out. That's all I knew about him. And right now he's sitting in a jail cell in The Hague waiting trial at this international criminal kangaroo court. Now, the UN claims it has universal jurisdiction. The United States never agreed to the Rome Statute that created this court, and yet they claim they could prosecute any American in this international criminal kangaroo court for crimes that aren't even defined, like aggression. What does that even mean, right? We don't have a trial by jury there. We don't have the traditional legal protections that we've come to expect in the West, the presumption of innocence, etc. So this is incredibly dangerous. We're this close to a one-world government, and it's not operated by the people that we think it is, right? We see the General Assembly, we see the Secretary General, we see the different councils and agencies, but behind the scenes, the people really making the policy is Bilderberg. It's the Council on Foreign Relations. It's the Trilateral Commission. It's these weird secret societies. And so this is a very, very dangerous development for humanity.
Yet somehow I think politicians think that they are going to play an important role in this one world government moving forward. And I'll get back to that in a second. I just want to touch on something that you said, because this tax on emission is not the first global tax that has crossed my ears. I don't remember who said this, if it was Biden or if it came from the European Union, but it was some talk about taxing businesses who move to other countries, like a global tax for, I don't remember exactly what it was about, but my impression back then, I think that's a couple of years ago, was that they were trying to implement some sort of global tax. So what is this global tax that they're working on right now?
So they've been trying to implement global taxes for 80 years. The problem is they've had a lot of trouble doing it. And you're absolutely right. In fact, I wrote very extensively on this effort to harmonize tax systems around the world. And what was happening a few years ago, actually, the U.S. government under Barack Obama helped lead the way through a law called FATCA that most Americans never heard of, but me as an American living overseas had a huge impact on my life and the lives of the other 8 million Americans who live in other countries. And what they were trying to do was create a system where there was automatic exchange of information between all tax agencies in the world. So no matter where you lived, all of your personal financial data would be shared with any government in the world. And this was supposed to serve as the foundation for eventually building a true global tax system. The one that they're working on right now, this is happening through an obscure UN agency called the International Maritime Organization. And the background on this, in 2023, Joe Biden and a bunch of other world leaders put into motion this process to start the taxation of global emissions. They, under the guise of safeguarding the planet from pollution, they said that these international ships that are moving goods and services across the world through the oceans are putting all this CO2 into the atmosphere, and that's causing climate change. And so they said, how do we prevent that? And they went to the table, they started negotiating, and they came up with different ideas. Well, they voted on the final solution just, again, a few weeks ago in London at the meeting of the IMO over the objections, I should add, of the Trump administration. The Trump administration circulated a letter and said, don't do this. We're not going to support it. This is wrong. This is an effort to, they said, redistribute our wealth under the guise of environmentalism, which is, of course, a big part of it, but it's much bigger than that. And it's a very strange formula, Rebecca. I don't even think they understand it themselves, but it's based on the intensity of emissions, and you get a certain allotment, but when you go over that allotment, you have to purchase credits from other companies, and all these companies have to pay the UN for these permissions. And so they have a price now on emissions per ton of carbon dioxide that comes out of these ships, and they say it's to incentivize the ship owners to reduce the intensity of the emissions of their shipping. What it's really aimed at doing is getting the first ever global tax on humanity into place as the foundation for imposing taxes on everything else that we can think of. So if they can tax shipping, they can tax anything. And if they can tax one thing, there's no limit to what they can tax. So this is, we have an expression in the United States called the camel's nose under the tent, right? First the camel's nose comes under, then the whole beast is under the tent, and then you're stuck in the tent with a camel. this IMO shipping tax is the camel's nose under the tent. Once the whole animal comes in, folks, watch out. The UN will have all the money it needs to do whatever it wants. And if you want to know what it wants to do, go read the Pact for the Future. Again, they want to micromanage every area of your life. All the governments agreed that they're all going to defer to the authority of the International Court of Justice. They all agreed that in the event of an emergency, the Secretary General and UN agencies were going to become the primary decision-making authorities. So all this is on paper, approved by every government in the world. And the thing that they're missing to make all these plans a reality is money. So folks understand, to the extent that we had any discussion about this in the American press, it was, are Americans going to pay more tax than other people? And that's an important question. Yes, Americans will pay more tax, but the really significant question that is not being talked about is what happens when the UN has the ability to raise its own money whenever it wants without the consent of member states, because that is what's coming if we're not careful.
So that makes a lot of sense why the UN is kissing ass, excuse the language, with Norwegian politicians in terms of our pension fund, our oil fund. We have a lot of money just sitting there waiting to be spent. And somehow our politicians think that they're special and smart or something, despite the fact that they cheat on their master's degrees. They never had any experience working in the workforce or being a normal human being in their life ever, because we have career politicians. But somehow the UN appoints our prime ministers. Last one, Erna Solberg, she was the leader of the sustainability goals. And then our current prime minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, he's the leader of the world's oceans or something like that. And our government has been very, very, very busy with Agenda 2030. And they don't hide it at all. You can go into our government's homepage and you can find everything you need about Agenda 2030 there, and the sustainability development goals as well. They are promoted as moral imperatives in schools, in media, in politics. Do you see this as an ideology? Oh God, I cannot pronounce that word even if I wanted to. Ideological, there we go. Stalinism under a humanitarian mask, or how do you view these Agenda 2030, the sustainability goals, all these little knickknacks that they get politicians in member states to do?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I've been alarmed about this from the very beginning. Right when they approved the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda back in 2015, I wrote a major article about it for the New American Magazine. Even though the American media wasn't talking about it, it was quite obvious that this was important. You had the head of the General Assembly at that time, Peter Thompson of Fiji, saying this was the master plan of humanity. Wait, what? You guys are making master plans for humanity and you're not even going to ask us, right? You had the Pope there to usher all of this in, Pope Francis, who at that time was relatively new. You had the Communist Chinese government using all their propaganda organs to say, we played a crucial role in developing this 2030 agenda. Wait, the most murderous government in human history played a role in developing a master plan for humanity, and nobody asked me? That's kind of crazy. You had the Secretary General of the UN at that time, Ban Ki-moon, said this was the Global Declaration of Interdependence. Now, that might not mean much to Norwegians, but it means a lot to Americans, right? Our country was born with a little document we call the Declaration of Independence. We got tired of the British government bossing us around and disrespecting our rights and our freedoms, and acting like the king and the parliament were totally free from any constraints, whether they came from God or anywhere else. And we said, no, we're not going to accept that anymore. God gave us rights. These rights include life, liberty, property, is what we said in this document. And if you won't respect them, we're not going to submit to your authority. We're going to be our own country. So this was a profound statement by the Secretary General, right? Forget your Declaration of Independence. We're now all moving together with this new Declaration of Interdependence. And I encourage people to read these things for themselves with a skeptical eye. There is, of course, the obligatory things that sound nice so that they can accuse us of being mean. Like, oh, we're going to solve world hunger. Oh, you don't want to solve world hunger? You're such a terrible human being. No, of course I want to solve world hunger.
Everybody gets education.
Right, education and health care, and we're going to eliminate poverty. And so these are window dressing, right? And people need to understand, too, when you delegate these kinds of authorities to government, you're essentially giving them a blank check, right? And I know Norwegians, Scandinavians don't use checks much, but a check is a document that you sign and then somebody can take money out of your bank account. If you give somebody a blank check, they can put in any number they want and completely drain your bank account. This is the equivalent of giving the UN a blank check on our lives, our money, our liberty, our property, our family, under the guise of solving these problems. Now, of course, if you look at the ideology enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals, it's exactly the opposite of what you would want if your goal was actually to solve poverty, solve hunger, save the environment. Right? And this is very easy to demonstrate empirically. I taught economics for 12 years. You can do some very simple exercises. What are the richest countries with the least amount of poverty in the world? Oh, it's all the countries with private property rights and a biblical tradition and an honest judiciary. I mean, these are basic facts that nobody can argue with. You look at what are the cleanest countries. Which countries have the cleanest environments? Again, it's all the countries with strong protections for private property rights, strong traditions of free markets, strong rule of law, etc. So we know how to save the environment. We know how to work on solving poverty and hunger. It doesn't involve communism, right? And yet if you read the Sustainable Development Goals, start with goal 10, right? We need to reduce inequality within and among nations. So National Socialism, Nazism, where you redistribute the wealth within the nation, that's not enough anymore. Now we need international socialism. And people need to understand, too, what that means. We're supposed to think of, like, you know, a poor, starving African and a billionaire in the West. They're going to take the billionaire's money and feed the African. Absolute baloney, right? They're going to take the money from what's left of the middle class, and they're going to give it to the dictators who are keeping people in poverty as a bribe to bring them on this agenda. Then you look at goal number 4. You mentioned education. This is one that is especially important for me because I think you can't understand their agenda without understanding that they're brainwashing the children to make it happen. Goal number 4 is very explicit. All learners, it says, need to be so brainwashed. It doesn't use that term. They're not just going to submit to sustainable development. The word used in the document is they're going to promote sustainable development. Right? That's got to be some pretty serious brainwashing, that the kids aren't just going to accept this. They're going to promote it. And then you keep reading on. It says we need education for global citizenship. That's just what it sounds like, right? They're going to brainwash your kids to be not citizens of Norway, citizens of the world.
The world, yeah.
Right? And you just keep reading down these things, right? Vaccines for everyone, abortions for everyone, mental health for everyone. I mean, it's a recipe for global tyranny. They actually say in the preface, we're going to transform the way societies produce and consume goods. I mean, this is just straight out of Karl Marx's 10 Planks of the Communist Manifesto, adapted with a new marketing label. So, folks, this is an agenda of global tyranny masquerading as a program to solve hunger and the environment, and it absolutely needs to be exposed. Now, good news, the Trump administration has told the UN that we reject and denounce the 2030 agenda. So I'm very grateful for what the Trump administration is doing there. Scandinavia and essentially the rest of the world is moving full speed ahead on this. And, it's part of Agenda 21, the agenda for the 21st century. Coming up in 2030, they'll replace that with the Resilience Development Goals. And so, folks, be aware, these are the master plans for humanity by these evildoers. And if you don't resist, they're going to get their way.
So very jealous of America's Donald Trump. But I just wanted to add, because communism has a sort of positive ring here in Western Europe for some absurd reason. And I think the UN sustainability goals addressed very nicely. They sound really pretty and nice when you read them out loud until you dive beneath the surface. I think it's important to point out that communism is more to the elites and for all people to suffer the same, just more.
And it's always been that, Rebecca. Going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, that was financed by the mega bankers on Wall Street. Okay, so it's always been a scam to weaponize the masses against the middle class so that the elites could rule over us and enslave us.
Exactly. So I think it's when people look at this sustainability goals and they say, well, you just want to make the world a better place. But why does that mean that we have to be worse off for other people to be better off? So I think that is a great way to look at it when somebody argues with you about the UN being a great organization. But you mentioned it. This is going to be my last question before I have a really important one for you, and we can top this off. I've taken a lot of your time already. I really appreciate it, Alex. You raised alarms about the indoctrination in public education. I think you even wrote a book about it. So where exactly do you see the UN or UNESCO pushing their influence into the Western classrooms?
Thank you, Rebecca. This is actually, in my opinion, the most important topic. And everybody's like, what? Education is the most important? Yes, education is the most important topic, because if they brainwash all our kids, we're going to lose 100% for sure. You know, might as well give up now and just prepare to be a good slave. So this is my latest book. I've done 2 books on education, again, because I regard it as the most important topic. This new one's called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools' War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. And it's been endorsed by a lot of great Americans. Our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, General Michael Flynn, National Security Advisor. Actually, the lady who wrote the foreword was the Minister of Education for the state of Arizona, and she finally realized what they were doing and quit. And so it's a fun story there. But what's happening with UNESCO is they're trying to standardize and globalize education around the world. And that's not just my opinion. You can read it very clearly in all of the UN's own documents. And I'll fast forward to the ending. They have something they call the World Core Curriculum. It was written by Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Robert Mueller, and he said, and the UN has said, that it should be taught to every child in every school all over the world in every country. And so I had to dig into this. You know, what is this World Core Curriculum? Well, it is an entirely new way of thinking about everything. Okay, and I have the teacher's manual for this document written by Robert Mueller, and he says in the foreword to the teacher's manual that this is all based on, he says, the teachings of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Djwhal Khul. Now, for most people, that doesn't mean anything, but I'll give you guys a little bit of insight into what that really does mean. Alice Bailey founded an organization called the Lucifer Publishing Company. If you're not familiar with the biblical tradition, Lucifer is another name for Satan. He's the fallen angel, the angel of light, who comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Okay, so Alice Bailey believed that Lucifer was the good guy who had come to rescue humanity from this oppressive God who had kept us imprisoned in the garden. And so the World Core Curriculum that the UN believes should be taught to every child is based on the teachings of a lady who founded the Lucifer Publishing Company and this Tibetan teacher. So the Tibetan teacher is not actually a Tibetan or a teacher or even a human being. Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with these spiritual entities that she described as ascended masters. If you read your Bible, they're not ascended masters. They're actually demons. That's very clearly in the scriptures. And so she was channeling these demonic entities that were telling her about where the world was going to go, about this, all the religions of the world are going to unite under a what she called a universal consciousness. The secrets of the secret societies, the mystery schools are going to be externalized so that the entire world is brought into these secrets over time. And she actually wrote a whole book on education. It's called Education in the New Age. And she says that world citizenship needs to be the goal of this education system based on Marxism, the teachings of Karl Marx, and using the methods of John Dewey, who, of course, was the guy who created, he's the founding father of the public school system in the United States, which was then exported to the rest of the world through our foreign aid programs. So it all comes full circle. They are indoctrinating your children right this moment to hate God, to hate their family, to hate their country, to believe that the UN is the answer to every possible problem. And they're also dumbing down your children, by the way, on an unbelievable level. Americans now, I hesitate to even say it, but the government's own data shows less than 1 in 3 children trapped in these government schools are even proficient in reading, writing, math, science, or history. That's the government's numbers, right? It's actually much worse than that, but the government itself admits less than 1 out of 3 children in these schools is even proficient at any of these things. So we have a major problem. If we don't deal with it, it's going to mean the loss of civilization, the loss of liberty, and global tyranny, almost without exception, unless we have some kind of miracle. And again, the UN is now very vocal about this. Now, as it's applied to the United States, and I'll give the U.S. as the example because it's the one I've studied the most. Bill Gates of hell, you guys all know Bill Gates, the Mr. COVID expert, climate expert, computer expert.
Vaccine expert, yeah.
So he went over to UNESCO headquarters, it's in Paris, in 2004, and he signed an agreement with UNESCO that they were going to create global standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, so all the teachers in the world would learn the same garbage, and the global technology to make it all work. And so now we see the integration of AI into education. In fact, the UN met in Beijing in 2019. They signed the AI in Education Agreement that they said they're going to use AI in all education to change the values of children. Right? And to go back to the Sustainable Development Agendas, 2030 Agenda, go read goal number 4. Very clear. The Agenda 21, go read chapter 36. It says education is indispensable for bringing about these changes that they're trying to bring about. And they also say it needs to include spiritual education. And so everybody kind of sees that, and the Hindus think, oh, they mean Hindu. The Christians think, oh, they mean Christian. The Jews think, oh, they mean Jew. They don't mean anything of the sort. They mean go back to Alice Bailey and read what this lunatic wrote. Then you'll understand what they mean. So you can't understand what's happening, Rebecca, I don't think, without understanding that we're now several generations into the indoctrination. And if we don't cut it off, if we don't stop it, it's all over.
We're not even allowed to homeschool our children here in Norway. I don't know how that is all over Europe, but I do know that we're not allowed to, as you in the US are.
I was in Sweden when the regime started kidnapping children from their parents for homeschooling. There was a few hundred homeschool families. This was in 2010, 2011. I was living there. We had just had our first child. The Swedish government passed the Education Reform Act. They banned homeschooling. They forced all the private schools, all the Christian schools, to teach the government curriculum, which was totally crazy. And what happened was hundreds of families fled the country. A lot of them went to Finland. Some went to Canada. They followed the example of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler was the first leader in history to criminalize parents educating their own children at home.
Which is insane.
Mm-hmm. And during the denazification program, it's one of the few things they didn't get rid of was the homeschool ban. So it's pretty sad.
Well, we'll see what happens, but this is very depressing and, soul-shattering information, to put it blunt. What would you say to people to, I don't know, take in this information, but also use it in some way that benefits them and leave them with some sort of hope? What do you say to people to lift them up in such dire and tragic times as we are living in right now?
Yeah, well, I have to say it, Rebecca. I know that, again, having lived in Scandinavia for a decade, I know that Christianity is, if not frowned upon, at least looked down upon. But I have to say it, right? I don't think you can understand what is happening in the world today without looking at it through a biblical context. The Bible describes a cosmic battle between good and evil, between God and Satan. That is what we are witnessing right now. The Bible repeatedly describes Satan using terms like God of this world, the prince of the power of the air. He has a lot of power and a lot of authority here. If you go to Psalm 2, you read 3,000 years ago, King David warned about the kings of the earth and the rulers conspiring together against God and his anointed. And so I think you have to understand this in this context. When I try to simplify the UN's agenda into just one sentence, take everything God teaches in the Bible about what's good and flip it upside down. Right? His first command was be fruitful and multiply, have children. Right? The UN says, no, children are bad. Right? You shouldn't have children. Bible commands respect for private property. Thou shalt not steal. The UN says, well, we're going to steal everything. God must not have realized resources wouldn't be equitably distributed. And on down the line, right? God invented nations. Deuteronomy 32, Acts 17, he divided mankind up into nations because that was his design for humanity. So what do we see? A satanic effort to undermine that. It was God's design that people should live in families, husband, wife, children. Now we see a satanic effort to undermine that. So you can't understand this without understanding it in that context, and that's why this is really good news, okay? Because I recognize all this information is unbelievably depressing. I started learning this when I was in college before I came to know the Lord, and it was overwhelming. Oh my goodness, these evildoers want a totalitarian, satanic one-world government, and here's little old me saying stop, and I'm all alone, and isn't this bad? But when you realize that God is sovereign, and God has a plan, and God is going to stop the evil, not only can you rest easy, you can rest with a big giant smile on your face because God sees what the wicked are doing. He is going to give them their rewards. They have an opportunity to repent right now, and they should. They should put their trust in Christ who died for their sins. But if they don't, they're going to suffer eternal consequences. And so for me, I don't get worried about it anymore. I don't stress about it anymore. I know that God is in control and he's got a perfect plan. But I do know also that I've got certain things that I need to be doing. I need to be resisting evil. Right? He is called, as a journalist, I look at Ephesians 5:11. God says, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. And what a blessing it is that I get to sit around and expose these evil works of darkness 6 days a week, 51 weeks out of the year. Wouldn't trade it for the world. So, yes, it's overwhelming. But the really good news is evil does not win. You can take it to the bank, and we all have some little small part to play in this, or we wouldn't be here. So get involved, folks. Start in your own life, start in your own home, start by educating yourself, and then work outward from there in your community, in your neighborhood, in your city, in your country. And man, we can expose these evildoers, we can push them back, and we must.
So I'll give you a little uplift as well at the end here, Alex, because the younger generation has actually turned to the church in Scandinavia. So more and more younger people, or well, young people, 15 through 25, they are turning to the church, especially the Catholic Church, actually, which is kind of weird because we don't really have a tradition for Catholicism here in Scandinavia, but that is what's happening. And this is not sponsored, by the way, but I listen to the Bible every day through the app. I think it's called Hallow. If I remember that correctly, I can put it up on the screen. So it's very helpful. And also, I think it's important to remember that when you have faith, especially if you are a Christian, that you move along without fear, right?
Amen. 365 times we're commanded by God to fear not. And so that's not an optional thing. That's mandatory. And to your point, Rebecca, I was in Stockholm just a few months ago, and we went to church there, a Baptist church, and it was twice the size of the last time we were in Sweden a year and a half before. It was just packed with people. And the pastor said something incredible, and I barely understood it with my broken Swedish, but he said they had done a survey of young people in Sweden about what they thought was going to be trending in 2025. We were there over Christmas and New Year, and the number one thing that young people thought was going to be trending in Sweden in 2025 was Jesus Christ. So praise the Lord. No matter how hard evildoers fight against the church and the truth, they will never succeed. They've been trying to stop us for 2,000 years. They've been burning us and killing us and feeding us to lions, but they will never stop us no matter what they do. So praise the Lord.
Amen. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day, Alex. I really appreciate it. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm very sure that our viewers will very much appreciate you. Where can they go to follow your work moving forward?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been a joy and an honor to be with you. Easiest place is my website, libertysentinel.org. People can sign up for our free newsletter there. It comes out twice a day, and we talk about all these things that we went over today. I'm also senior editor at the New American Magazine. To your point, we will never stop printing printed issues because the tyrants can't censor that. And then I'm a senior fellow at Classical Conversations for folks who are interested in pursuing real education for their children. It's an incredible option. I actually have my kids registered there. We've got 135,000 students so far. So those are the three easy places. And then on X, thank you, Elon Musk, for opening up some free speech, Alex Newman _JOU. And thank you again, Rebecca. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.